Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Edge in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting instability. Alright, after staring at this for a while, I've decided what better thing for an unstable, instable landscape than a wheeled boat helicopter. So it'll be about right here somewhere. And then I'm going to turn these into conversing faces and heads, mouths, eyes, weirdness, a little distorted, and see where it goes from there.
Capable against the United States, a dire threat to our security, as Massachusetts Senator Songus, a noted Dove, put it at the time. In another propaganda coup of December 1987, a Sandinista defector was presented with elaborate accompanying fanfare in the media. He produced a series of revelations about Sandinista intentions, the most stunning of which was that Nicaragua was hoping to obtain jet planes to defend its territory from U.S. attack, plainly an intolerable outrage. It is, of course, well understood that Nicaragua had no other way to prevent the CIA from supplying the forces it directs within Nicaragua, or to interfere with the surveillance flights by U.S. aircraft that provide these forces with up-to-the-minute intelligence on Nicaraguan troop deployments so that they can safely attack soft targets in accordance with Pentagon and State Department directives. The logic is clear. Nicaragua has no right of self-defense. It is intolerable, tantamount to aggression, for Nicaragua to interfere with U.S. violence and terror by attempting to defend its airspace or by attacking the U.S. proxy forces. For the same reason, the report by the same defector that Nicaragua intended to reduce its military forces while providing light arms to the population for defense against possible U.S. invasion elicited further outrage as it was transmuted by the free press into a threat to conquer the hemisphere. One might ask why Nicaragua is so intent on obtaining Soviet planes. Why not French Mirage jets instead? In fact, the Sandinistas would be quite happy to obtain jet interceptors from France and quite openly say so. They cannot, because U.S. pressure has blocked supply from any non-communist source. All of this is unreportable because it would give the game away. A corollary to the principle that official enemies do not have the right of self-defense is that if Nicaragua attacks Contra forces within its own territory, the United States plainly has the right to provide military aid to its proxies. The Byrd Amendment on Assistance for the Nicaraguan Resistance, voted by the Senate in August 1988, with the effusive support of leading Doves, permits military aid to the proxy forces within Nicaragua in the event of an unprovoked attack against the Contras or a continued unacceptable level of military assistance by Soviet bloc countries, all other sources having been barred, and Washington, of course, being the judge of what is acceptable. The August 5th Senate debate on the Byrd Amendment gains heightened significance from its timing. 3 days earlier, the Contras had attacked the crowded passenger vessel Mission of Peace after allowing an Army patrol boat to pass by. They had killed 2 people and wounded 27, all civilians, including a Baptist minister from New Jersey, a member of a U.S. religious delegation. The Senate Doves, who bitterly condemned the Sandinistas, made no mention of this event. Perhaps they had missed the tiny notice it received the day before in the New York Times, tacked on to a column reporting their deliberations. There was no subsequent commentary. The logic is again clear. If the Sandinistas seek to root out the U.S.-run terrorists who carried out this atrocity, that proves that they are communist totalitarians, and we are entitled to send military as well as so-called humanitarian aid to the resistance so that they can pursue their tasks more effectively. The general outlines of U.S. policy are presented in a lucid manner by a Carter administration Latin American specialist, Robert Pastor, who is actually at the dovish extreme of the political and ideological spectrum. He explains that the United States, I'm quoting, that the United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations in the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. In short, Nicaragua should be free to do what we determine to be right and proper, and Nicaragua should achieve self-determination in the manner that the United States defines as appropriate. In the first lecture, I mentioned some of the ways of approaching the study of the media and evaluating models of media performance. One appropriate method is to consider the spectrum of opinion that is allowed expression. According to the propaganda model, one would expect the spectrum to be bounded by the elite consensus while encouraging tactical debate within it. Consider U.S. policy with regard to Nicaragua. That's probably elicited more controversy and impassioned rhetoric than any other single topic during the past several years. There is debate between the hawks on the one side and the doves on the other. The position of the hawks is expressed by a declaration of the State and Defense Departments on International Human Rights Day in December 1986. They asserted that in the American continent there is no regime more barbaric and bloody, no regime that violates human rights in a manner more constant and permanent than the Sandinista regime. Similar sentiments are widely voiced in the media and the political system, and it follows that we should support the democratic resistance to communist terror. At the other extreme, the doves generally agree that we should dismiss the World Court, the United Nations, and other hostile forums, as they're called, that pander to communists and pathological third world anti-Americanism. The doves offer their support for the noble objective of the Reagan administration to somehow democratize Nicaragua, but they feel that the Contras are not the instrument that will achieve that objective. I've been quoting Representative Michael Barnes, who was one of the most outspoken critics of the Contra option. A leading Senate dove, Alan Cranston, recognizes that the Contra effort is woefully inadequate to achieve democracy in Nicaragua, in his words, so we should find other means to isolate the reprehensible government in Managua and leave it to fester in its own juices. Media doves observe that Mr. Reagan's policy of supporting the Contras is a clear failure, so we should acquiesce in some negotiated regional settlement that would be enforced by Nicaragua's neighbors. That's Tom Wicker of the New York Times. Expressing the same thought, the editors of the Washington Post see the Contras as an imperfect instrument, so we must find other means to fit Nicaragua back into a Central American mode and impose reasonable conduct by a regional standard. Other doves feel that we should not too quickly reject the State Department argument that agricultural cooperatives are legitimate targets for Contra attacks. The reason, I'm quoting, is that in a Marxist society geared for war, there are no clear lines separating officials, soldiers, and civilians. What is required is careful cost-benefit analysis, a determination of the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in, and the likelihood that democracy will emerge at the other end. Those are the words of New Republic editor Michael Kinsley. Neither he nor the State Department explain why similar arguments do not justify attacks by Abu Nidal on Israeli kibbutzim, which are far better defended against an incomparably lesser threat. Notice that regional arrangements need not be imposed on our Salvadoran and Guatemalan friends, who have slaughtered perhaps 150,000 people during this period, or on our clients in Honduras, who kill fewer outright, but have left hundreds of thousands to starve to death while the country exports food for the profit of agribusiness. Their countries already conform to the Central American mode of repression, exploitation, and rule by privileged elements that accede to the demands of U.S. power, what we call democracy, so even hideous atrocities are of no account, and they merit aid and support, with occasional expressions of regret if the terror, torture, and mutilation become too visible to ignore. By 1986, the Contra option was opposed by 80% of American leaders, polls report. The propaganda model would therefore predict debate over Contra aid, but near unanimity in opposition to the Sandinistas. To test the hypothesis, consider the period of maximum intensity of debate over Nicaragua policy, the first 3 months of 1986, when attention was focused on the issue of Contra aid. During these months, the New York Times and the Washington Post, the two major national newspapers, they ran no less than 85 opinion columns on the matter. That includes their regular columnists. As expected, they were divided over Contra aid. But of the 85 columns, all 85 were critical of the Sandinistas, the vast majority harshly so. Thus, 100% conformity was achieved on the major issue. It's not that more sympathetic voices are lacking in the mainstream. There are many who would easily qualify for admission to the debate if they had the right things to say. This includes Latin American scholars whose opinion pieces are regularly rejected by the press, or the charitable development agency Oxfam, with long experience in the region, which found Nicaragua's record to be exceptional among the 76 developing countries in which it works in the commitment of the political leadership to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the development process. I'm quoting here an Oxfam report. Or consider the founder of Costa Rican democracy, Jose Figueres. Just at the time we're speaking of, early 1986, he had described himself in an interview as pro-Sandinista and quite friendly toward the Sandinistas. He was an observer in the 1984 elections, and he said that the 2-to-1 margin in favor of the Sandinistas in these elections certainly seemed to reflect what you find in the streets. Figueres condemned what he called Washington's incredible policies of persecuting the Sandinistas and Washington's efforts to undo Costa Rica's social institutions and to turn the whole economy over to the local oligarchy or to U.S. or European companies. Of course, as a dedicated supporter of the United States, he found these efforts, in his words, no doubt well-intentioned. The United States, he said, is turning most Central Americans into mercenaries for its attack against Nicaragua. I've been familiar with Nicaragua all my life, he said, and never before have I seen, as I do now, a Nicaraguan government that cares for its people. In another interview at the same time, he reiterated that for the first time, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people, his words. Commenting on a recent visit, he said that he found a surprising amount of support for the government in what he called an invaded country, adding that the United States should allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. Such comments as these lack ideological serviceability. The same is true of Figueres' statement that he understands why La Prensa was closed, having censored the press himself when Costa Rica was under attack by Somoza in the 1950s. Hence, Central America's leading democratic figure must be censored out of the media, as he is, though his name can still be invoked for the anti-Sandinista crusade. Thus, New York Times Central America correspondent James Lemoyne, in one of his anti-Sandinista diatribes, refers to Figueres as the man who is widely considered the father of Costa Rican democracy. But he does not tell us, nor would he or his colleagues ever tell us, what Figueres has to say about the Sandinistas. The front pages of the New York Times present a picture of Nicaragua as seen through the eyes of their reporter James Lemoyne as he briefly passed through. A brutal and repressive state under one-party rule with crowds of pot-bellied urchins in the streets, state security agents ubiquitous, the army everywhere, growing support for the peasant army resisting Sandinista oppression, and the population reduced to bitterness and apathy. That's his description, though somehow they are resisting a foreign attack under which any other state in the region and most elsewhere would have quickly crumbled. The New York Times does not present the picture that was seen by the CIA-appointed press spokesman for the Contras, Edgar Chamorro, on a 3-week visit at the same time. Speaking to dozens of people in the streets after a Sandinista rally, he found them, in his words, very aware, very politically educated, very committed. They thought for themselves. They were there because they wanted to be there. The days are gone when a dictator can get up and harangue people. What I have seen here, he said, is very, very positive. People are walking on their own 2 feet, regaining the dignity and nationalism that they had lost under Somoza. He saw very little militarization and a deep sense of equality, what he called one of the accomplishments of the revolution. I didn't see people hungry, he said. Most people look very healthy, strong, and alive. And he saw few beggars, unlike Honduras, or even in the city streets of the United States, he added. The opposition he described as the old oligarchy reliant on the United States. The war has led to a sense of nationalism and patriotism on the part of the youth who are drafted. The Sandinistas continue to be a people's party with commitment and goals that inspire so many people. They are Nicaraguan nationalists, revolutionaries, who want a more egalitarian model to improve the lives of the majority. The elections were good, the government is legitimate, and we should try to change from inside. I've just been quoting Chamorro's actual words from an interview that appeared in a tiny and obscure journal, and Chamorro himself points out that after he left the Contras, he found media access difficult, although when he was the spokesman, it was quite simple. The general reading public does not receive a range of perceptions such as these, but only one, the one that accords with the needs of American power. A year after these visits by Lemoyne and Chamorro, severe malnutrition began to appear in Managua and parts of the countryside, as U.S. terror and economic warfare continued to take their bitter toll in a pathetically poor country that is utterly dependent on economic relations with the United States for obvious historical and geopolitical reasons. George Shultz, Elliott Abrams, and their cohorts may not have overthrown the government, but they can take pride in having vanquished the programs of development, preventive medical care, and welfare. They can take pride in a notable increase in dying infants, epidemics, and other normal features of the Central American mode to which Nicaragua is to be restored by U.S. benevolence. The propaganda system may cover their tracks today, but history will render a different judgment. Let's return now to the 85 columns in the Washington Post and the New York Times at the peak period of Contra debate. Still more interesting than the uniform hostility to the Sandinistas was the choice of topics. There are two very striking differences between the Sandinistas and the U.S. favorites who adhere to regional standards. The first of these is that the Sandinistas, whatever their sins, had not conducted campaigns of mass slaughter, torture, mutilation, and general terror to traumatize the population. In the 85 columns, there is not one phrase referring to this matter. The second major difference between the Sandinistas and the U.S. clients is that the Sandinistas had diverted resources to the poor majority and had attempted measures of meaningful social reform. In fact, they had done so quite successfully until U.S. economic and military warfare succeeded in reversing the unwelcome improvement in health and welfare standards, literacy, and development. These facts merit two passing phrases in 85 columns, one in a bitter condemnation of what's called the generally appalling leadership in this repressive society. In the 85 columns, there is no mention at all of Sandinista efforts to maintain a neutralist posture. For example, there is no mention of the fact that at the time of the U.S. embargo that has virtually wiped out private business and reduced the economy to bare survival, Nicaraguan trade with the Soviet bloc was about 20% of total trade. That's well below the figure for Europe and most of the Third World. That fact is inconsistent with required dogma, and therefore it is unmentionable in the media, anywhere to my knowledge. Let's turn now to another sample of opinion in the media a year later. In the first 6 months of 1987, the same two journals, the New York Times and the Washington Post, ran 61 columns and editorials relevant to U.S. policy in Nicaragua. Of these, 13 said nothing about the Sandinistas. Of the 48 that expressed an opinion, 46 were anti-Sandinista, again, most of them bitterly so. Of the two columns that expressed some sympathy for the Sandinistas, one was by Nicaraguan Ambassador Carlos Tunnerman. The other was by Dr. Kevin Cahill. He is the director of the Tropical Disease Center at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, the only non-Nicaraguan commentator in the sample who could draw upon personal experience in Nicaragua and elsewhere in the Third World. His column was also the only one that took note of the successful Nicaraguan health and literacy measures and what he called the struggle against oppression and corruption waged under conditions of extreme adversity imposed by U.S. terror and economic warfare. Cahill's is also one of the two contributions among 61 that mention the World Court decision and international law. Once again, In these 61 columns, there is not a single phrase referring to the fact that unlike the U.S. clients in the so-called fledgling democracies, the Sandinistas had not launched a campaign of terror and slaughter to traumatize their populations. The totalitarian Sandinistas are contrasted with the struggling democracies of Central America, the imperfect but working democracy of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which, although under communist guerrilla siege, is an imperfect democracy, but a democracy with an elected government. Notice that it is unlike Nicaragua, where there were no elections, so Washington has decreed. Well after the 1984 elections that established democracy in El Salvador to the applause of the free press, the human rights organization Socorro Jurídico, which operates under the protection of the Archdiocese of San Salvador, observed that the continuing terror is still conducted by the same members of the armed forces who enjoy official approval and are adequately trained to carry out these acts of collective suffering. Salvadoran society, affected by terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, shows the following traits, they said: collective intimidation and generalized fear on the one hand, and on the other, the internalized acceptance of the terror because of the daily and frequent use of violent means. In general, society accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, including the right to life, have absolutely no overriding value for society. These comments also apply to the supervisors of these operations in Washington. The fact was underscored by George Shultz in one of his lamentations on terrorism, a talk that he delivered at the very moment of the U.S. bombing of Libya. In El Salvador, he declared, "The results are something all Americans can be proud of. At least, all Americans who enjoy the sight of tortured bodies, starving children, terror and panic, and generalized fear." And James Lemoyne of the New York Times concludes that American support for elected governments in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras has been a relative success, which is no doubt true by some standards. The problem throughout, according to the media, is to find some way to compel Nicaragua to rein in its revolutionary army, as Democratic Senator Terry Sanford demands, an army that is illegitimately rampaging inside Nicaragua when it seeks to defend the country from U.S. attack. Apart from regular unsupported allegations of Sandinista aid to the Salvadoran guerrillas, the proclaimed basis for the fears of Sandinista aggression is another coup of the State Department propaganda services in their what they call their Operation Truth. This is based upon a speech in which Comandante Tomas Borge expressed his hopes that Nicaragua would be an example that others would follow. He explained that Nicaragua cannot export our revolution, but can only export our example, while the people themselves of these countries must make their own revolutions. In this sense, he said, the Nicaraguan revolution transcends national boundaries. In a conscious and purposeful fraud, State Department psychological warfare operations converted these words into the threat of military conquest in pursuit of a revolution without borders. That phrase was used as the title of the pathetic
All right, so there you have it.
State
What else could you
Department
need
white paper
in
on
turbulent
alleged
times
Nicaraguan aggression,
other than a
and it's
chariot boat
constantly
helicopter
used since,
and
often
some good
accompanied by
conversation?
claim
So there you
that
have
this
it.
is a Sandinista Mein Kampf,
All right,
as
well,
George
that's it for
Shultz
the moment. I'll
warned
see where this goes from here. Thanks for watching.
the
That's
same
Adam Sturch broadcasting from the
fabrication
Mushroom
served
Mansion,
as
Taos, New
climax for
Mexico, working
Reagan's
on oil
successful
painting
effort to obtain $100 million
instability.
from Congress for the proxy army.